Today, we're doing our introductory Amazon kind of course webinar on deductions, but we'll be exploring a little bit of co-op today too, which I'm not sure technically if that kind of falls under that umbrella or not. We added in a little bit of a kind of section on that, which we're sort of excited about. We're going to be producing a lot more content on co-op with Amazon. So if that's something that you guys are dealing with, have questions about, please let us know in the chat. We'd love to kind of talk about that, open up that conversation a little bit too. I am Peter. This is Allie. For those of you who've never been here before, we do content coordination, which just means we're coming up with the webinars, we're doing the articles, ebooks, all of the content that we're producing, the free educational content that we produce for you guys really kind of flows through us. So what that means is that we want you to let us know what you'd like to see more of. Let us be your kind of research arm so that we can kind of read the stuff for you and explore those avenues for your team. So that you can kind of just be on the receiving end of it instead of having to dive through all of the stuff. So that's that. Today, I mentioned we're going to do a little bit, a tiny section on co-op and provisions as well. We're going to start with a higher level, just kind of explanation of Amazon deductions before going into that. And then we'll talk about avoiding and disputing shortage deductions primarily. And that'll be kind of the main sort of focus because it's obviously such a huge stumbling block for so many Amazon suppliers. And then we'll have our general kind of Q&A at the end as well. Speaking of questions, we always get these are some pretty common FAQs. Will you be getting a copy of the slide deck? Absolutely, in the next 3 to 4 business days. And also, one thing we don't have here, but we record all of these and we put them up on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and you just search Supply Pike, you can give us a follow there and just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of the things that we're covering. We have a lot of content on Walmart. That's how we got our start. But we're growing our Amazon kind of base as well, as covering some Kroger and Target stuff and just kind of general retail supplier content as well. So definitely give us a follow on YouTube to keep your finger on the pulse of what we're kind of pushing out in terms of webinars every month. And then we have a chat, which is public, the way that we can all kind of interact with each other publicly. If you want to answer a question that we're asking, that would go in the chat. But if you have a more of a formal question, we tend to get a lot of questions in these webinars. So if you have more of a formal question for us, put that in the Q&A tab, which is down there and a little bit more to the right, probably for those of you joining us. And that's how, those are the best ways to interact with us. We want to create an interactive environment where we can all kind of share resources and data with each other, at least in as much as the information is shareable, to create a community for all of us here. So that's what the chat is for. The Q&A is for more formal questions. And most of those we'll kind of send back out to all of y'all anyways, to see what kind of rings true or not for your situation too. All right. I mentioned our YouTube page, but Supply Pike, generally, we sell software to suppliers that helps them basically detect revenue loss and prevent it and win some of it back in cases of invalid deductions and invalid fines across those major retailers that I mentioned already: Walmart, Amazon, Kroger, and Target. We're right now doing some research into other major retailers in a few different spaces. We don't want to get specific because we don't know how we're going to expand next year, at least specifically, but we are looking into some others. So that's really exciting for us right now. But these are some of our partners down here that we work with, that we're really happy to work with, who are moving a lot of stuff in Walmart and Amazon and other major retailers. And we've had a big kind of retail impact since our start about 5 years ago. So that's who we are. We're a software company. We sell that software. But our team, we're less on the sales side and more on the kind of early engagement. And as I said, our passion is for creating free educational content that y'all can engage with and that can help your business in a way that isn't a business itself. So that's all that. Allie, take it away. What are Amazon deductions?
That's a great question, Peter. And thank you for that intro. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about, the basics of Amazon deductions. And like Peter said, we'll do a little bit on co-op and provisions, which are kind of attached to that. And then we'll get into preventing Amazon deductions, and do kind of a workflow of how it is like to submit and dispute a Amazon deduction as well. So we've got a lot of content to cover, and I'll be just calling out a couple resources that we will have available, that we'd love for you to share if you're interested in more. And please ask questions along the way. We'd love to engage with you guys. So let's start. What are Amazon deductions? So there's kind of two areas or buckets that we're going to focus on today about why your Amazon business may not be getting paid. And the first one is deductions. You may have deductions at your other businesses, like Walmart, Amazon we're talking about today, Kroger and Target. And the one that we see the most or focus on the most, especially with the customers that we work with at Supply Pike, are deductions. And there's a lot of different ways and phrases that you can, kind of bucket deductions. But at Amazon specifically, they refer to deductions as a result of supply chain defects. And there are 5 main focus areas at Amazon specifically that we'll get into. One thing to note, no matter what retailer you go to, you're going to see the term deductions as a result of some kind of defect in the supply chain, in your invoicing, whatever the case may be. And that's going to be a literal deduction from your invoice. So the example being, let's say you had an invoice for $1,000. You're ready to receive that back. You're excited to get paid, and you realize that it's only $800. Where did that other $200 that you were expecting go? Well, you may log into your retailer portal, wherever that may be, and you will go ahead and look at that and say, okay, it looks like I got a deduction. What does that mean? And that's where suppliers will begin the process of deciding what that deduction even means. At some retailers, you're going to see different codes. At Amazon specifically, it's going to be mostly some kind of phrase, which we're going to get into those 5 main buckets or phrases that kind of describe what the deduction is about. And then it's a term of it's determining validity of that deduction. So as a supplier, should I be accountable for that deduction? Did something go wrong on my end? Or is that deduction invalid? And is that something that I should be paid back on, or that Amazon should reverse due to the circumstances and the evidence that you can provide? We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I did kind of want to frame up the way that deductions work at retailers. And now we'll specifically talk a little bit more about Amazon and how they deal with deductions. So like I said, there are 5 focus areas of deductions at Amazon. If you log into your Vendor Central portal and you're looking around, you may see different phrases mentioned on any of your deductions that may be in your payments tab. And we'll kind of talk about how you navigate Vendor Central and find those. But those 5 main buckets are really important to understand, especially when it comes to, like I said, determining validity, understanding the process, maybe doing some root cause analysis on your processes as a supplier or a vendor team. So we're going to go through those now. The first being missing invoices, and the second being invoices that can't be processed. As I'm going down these, we'll kind of go in the next slides and dig into these deeper, but you'll start to see a pattern. So the first 2 are going to be about invoices. So one, the plethora of reasons where an invoice could be missing, and then the other reasons where invoices may not be able to be processed, whether they're incomplete information or they are being processed manually because of some error. Again, we'll get into some of those issues there. And then the second kind of focus area is shortages, and those are broken out into potential shortages and remaining shortages. That's probably what we'll focus the most on. If anyone in the chat says they want to focus on a different focus area, we can kind of pivot that. But we work with, like we said, 500 plus suppliers, and across all retailers and specifically at Amazon as well, shortages tend to be the most pervasive problem in their businesses. So we're going to focus on shortages and what those mean and how you kind of determine the difference between potential and remaining shortages. And then lastly is supply chain, invoicing, and catalog defects. This is kind of what I call the catch-all bucket. It's, we're already talking about invoices at the top. You could kind of point to supply chain and catalog defects in, missing invoices or shortages. So to me, when I'm looking at Amazon deductions, this is anything that doesn't, necessarily fit into those 4 buckets before. And this is where I would we'll get into how you navigate on Vendor Central, but check especially for root cause analysis when it comes to issues that are continuing to happen. You probably will see one type of deduction in this last category, and that may be a point to several other types of deductions that you're getting or just other defects that are occurring. So we'll get into that as well. So we're going to first focus on those invoices and some of the issues that can arise with these 2 focus areas with Amazon deductions. So let's define what missing invoices are, and let's define that in the way that Amazon describes that. So the first thing to say is Amazon's not going to pay a supplier if they're unable to match an invoice with delivered products. That makes sense. That's pretty standard across the industry. If there's not a receipt or an invoice rather, then they're not going to be able to pay you for those goods. What are some of the reasons that an invoice may be missing at Amazon? Or really any other retailer, but we'll talk specifically about Amazon. And one thing to note with invoices, there may be other retailers that you're shipping to that have a more manual process, but Amazon uses a matching system, and they do that more automatically with different technology that they have at their fulfillment centers. So one common theme or thread that you'll see throughout this is that an invoice may not be missing, but it may not be complying to the systems that Amazon has. So it's going to show up as missing, or it's going to be manually processed. But the specific reasons for missing invoices at Amazon is the invoice could never be sent. That could be true, that there was just a lapse in sending that invoice, and that would be an error on the supplier. It could be that the invoice was sent, but it hasn't been received yet. That could be a timing issue, or it could be sent, but it's never received because of an EDI issue or other specific issues that could create either a timing issue or a technology or connection issue. Other reasons for missing invoices is that the invoice doesn't contain the needed information to automatically identify and match the invoice. So making sure that those invoices are filled out completely, that they have the correct information, and that they're compliant with the systems that Amazon has in place for automatically identifying and matching invoices to their POs. We'll talk about this later, but Amazon does have different manuals or information guides on how you can make sure that your barcodes are set up correctly. And I know one of those is called a compliance manual that you can find in Vendor Central. Another one is a lead time, so for accurate PO management. So we can kind of get into this later, but I wanted to kind of tease some of the ways that you can kind of understand what Amazon is asking for. And then lastly, the invoice could also be rejected due to non-compliance, kind of what I was speaking to before, a barcode not being set up correctly, incomplete or incorrect information, or kind of falling under any type of defect that would create the invoice to not be able to be used by the matching system or the manual matching system as well. Now let's talk a little bit about invoices that can't be processed. So this is going to be different than missing because Amazon does actually have the invoice, but it can't be processed because of errors or inconsistencies. There is a plethora of reasons why a invoice may not be able to be processed. I've listed a couple of them here, and these are the ones we see commonly that are easy to kind of graze over and not double check. So making sure that you have the correct tax rates and making sure that those are complete. Same with Amazon tax registration numbers. Another one is the Amazon bill to address, making sure that's correct and complete. And then any EDI issues that you may be having, not whether it's timing or receiving those correctly, etc. But just making sure that they're able to be processed without having to be pulled manually or being sent back because of inconsistencies. All right, so that's invoices. Pretty table stakes. If you've been in the supplier business before, you understand the importance of having correct invoices and those being sent at the correct time. But now we're going to get into kind of the section that we tend to spend the most time in, like I said, because shortages are the problem that seems to be affecting suppliers the most. I'll mention this now because it's just top of mind, but we do have another great Amazon resource. If you are struggling with Amazon deductions, and that usually tends to be shortages, we've got a great webinar on strategy with that, especially due to timing. It's called Amazon Dispute Timeliness. I believe we did that one just a couple weeks ago. So Peter should be able to send that recording and the link to the PDF slide deck. So go check that out if you're having more questions on that. But I'd also be happy to talk through that a little bit here since we'll spend more time on shortages. All right, so really quick, I'll kind of graze through this because I think most people are aware of what shortages are, but just if you need a refresher, the definition of a shortage is the quantity of the item on the invoice does not match the quantity the facility says it received, and it's going to be less than that. Amazon also has their own jargon for what a shortage is. So if you see someone referring to a PQV or a purchase quantity variance, that is what they're talking about. And this illustration is the most helpful for me when I'm talking about shortages. So let's say the invoice had these juice boxes, the grapefruit ones, and then the pomegranate ones. And everything looks great. You send it out, or your 3PL delivers it to the facility. And then Amazon comes back and says, we never received these grapefruit juice boxes. We only received these, we did receive the grapefruit juice boxes. We never received the pomegranate juice boxes. So we're not paying you for them. And that would be kind of where you start this journey of addressing if this is correct or not. So at Amazon, there is a difference between potential shortages and remaining shortages, and that can really help you understand how you can tackle those and what's most important to go after. But what is the same for both of them is that the quantity of an item on the invoice does not match the quantity the facility says it received. Now, the difference between potential and remaining shortages is basically timing. If you think of a stoplight, or if you think of, sports like soccer, where they have a yellow card and red card, think of potential shortages as a yellow card. It's more like a warning saying, hey, our system is not able to match this invoice quantity to what we are actually receiving. It may be coming later. You still kind of have a window where it's not considered a set in stone shortage. It's more of a warning, and it can help suppliers say, oh, I'm seeing a shortage. This should be correct. Or I know that I sent, where this is in the process. It's really, again, helpful just to kind of send out a warning, and then you can kind of check that as you go along. This is one that depending on your systems, you may not need to check often, but if you do receive remaining shortages, that's where it's going to be more of a red flag or a red card. Remaining shortages are saying, hey, our system had time to check, based on timing, this is now going to go into remaining shortages. We've received the information we're going to receive. It's past the delivery date. And the remaining amount of the invoice is not matched. So this is when it would be handed over soon to the supplier to dispute. This is usually going to be due to a supply chain defect or shipping defect. Some of those may include, you've got a package that's labeled and it looks like it's one SKU and it's really two different SKUs in a package. There's a whole guide on packaging for Amazon specifically. Every retailer has one. So if that's your issue, you can go download that. But if I were a supplier and I was focusing on something, I may look at potential shortages and say, okay, I see those. Oh, this one looks really interesting. Let me kind of analyze this and see if there's anything I can do ahead of time to either gather documentation for this or sort this out to make sure that it doesn't hit remaining shortages. But I would spend most of my time focusing on those remaining shortages because those will 99% of the time not be matched after they've moved to a remaining shortage. All right. So there's a lot of reasons why a shortage may occur. That may be one of the reasons why lots of suppliers receive them. And it can be from the beginning of your product being set up in Vendor Central all the way to when it's supposed to arrive to the FC and even past that. So we'll kind of go through some of those examples. If you have ones that you'd like to share, please share them in the chat. We want to learn from each other. So some of those may be errors in the catalog setup or ASINs. Item setup is very key, but it also can be a place where suppliers make mistakes that just continue to cause issues. One thing I would say is make sure that you're using the correct pack number. So something we see at Walmart a lot, and then we have seen at Amazon as well, is, you know, a supplier setting up their catalog or their item setup, it's the same term, and putting the case pack quantity instead of the warehouse pack quantity, and then they're confused on why they're getting so many errors. So just making sure simple things like that are filled out correctly. Other things are forgetting the ASN or the ASN being sent with incorrect information. That's the advanced shipping notice. Other things is sending the invoice too early or duplicating the invoice. So making sure that timing is correct and not sending two invoices. We can talk about how you can do that if a PO gets canceled or something is wonky with the initial PO, but duplicating the invoices, for the most part, a no-no. Other things is compliance with Amazon's labeling standards. So go check out that documentation if you're seeing a lot of defects around labeling. Another one is vendor lead time. So making sure you have accurate PO management and being proactive if you're not going to have the correct SKU or if you're having a substitution, etc. Other things is if you're not reviewing Amazon's delivery compliance, these are Amazon's rules that they set in place. They get to make those rules, and if you're not compliant with them, they will send you a deduction. Other things is inbound receivable, if it's having to be processed manually. We've talked about this a lot. So if there's any errors with the barcode, the label, if you're shipping pallets to Amazon, that's going to create issues if, you know, it's done incorrectly, or maybe correct in the way that other retailers do it, but incorrect to Amazon's specific asks that they have. So lots of teams have someone who focuses on that specifically. If you don't have someone on your team who does that, I would go ahead and look at some of those standard guides that Amazon has listed for suppliers in the Learn section of Vendor Central. And then another one is issues with loss prevention. I won't go into this too much. That can kind of go under returns as well. I would say go check out our webinar on Amazon Returns 101 if you have questions about that, because it's just another rabbit hole for another day. All right, and then lastly, we have the last focus area of Amazon deductions. That's your supply chain, invoicing, and catalog defects. So you can see the overlap that we've kind of talked through here. These are the types of supply chain, invoicing, and catalog defects. I'll kind of breeze over these. You can see how they'll start to kind of touch on some of the other things that we had listed in shortages and in the invoicing categories. But again, this is kind of anything that can't be tied to those two. So you've got, you're already invoiced. Amazon is not going to pay you twice for one PO. Late shipping, invoiced for canceled items, invoice quantity greater than ordered quantity. That's also called an overage. And that can occur with a shortage based on how your products are labeled. So very important to understand the dynamic of how those play together. And then purchase price variance, so making sure that those are correct and that they're not, that they are matching, so that you're being paid correctly and that there's no confusion for either side. Incorrect product received. This can be a labeling error, or this can truly be that the supplier sent the incorrect product, or that the 3PL delivered the wrong product. Again, you can kind of go into the different scenarios there. We'll go through the rest of these pretty quickly. Incorrect unit versus pack quantity. Again, making sure those items are set up correctly, and then through the process that the correct unit is being used or the correct pack quantity is being used. Multiple ASINs for a single product, making sure that it's a 1-for-1 there. Unrecognized product. This could happen a lot of different ways. Usually what we see is another confusion about either the ASIN or missing your delivery date, or something being incorrect for the PO versus the invoice. Other things are overages not invoiced, deleted appointment, product not listed on purchase order, or liquidated products. And we can go into those if anyone has questions. But again, it can kind of be a catch-all where if that scenario isn't for, invoices not processed or missing invoice or shortages, it will most likely be in this last category. And like I mentioned, if we're talking about how you navigate Vendor Central, you can actually go into the scorecard and it will list the percentage of the defect rate you have across the months. It usually goes, I think it goes back about 6 months. I'd have to go back and check, but you can kind of see what each one of those defects means, the total amount that you have. And this kind of helps you dig in, especially on a root cause analysis. I will say using Vendor Central, as you know, has its pros and cons. I would say this is a pro. You can really drill it down into underlying issues and then track, your improvement from a deduction, especially in this area of Vendor Central. All right. And then lastly, this is more of a strategy or like high level thinking after we've kind of gone over all of the different buckets with deductions. There's good news and bad news here. The good news is if you are seeing a lot of potential shortages, you may be able to really spend your time focusing on potential shortages and clear up almost all of your issues because, it's touching other issues that you may be seeing, and you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Whereas the bad news may be that if you have a lot of potential or remaining shortages or supply chain defects, that you may see them start to kind of pop up in other areas with your Amazon deductions. So it can be either, something that's optimistic, where if you really focus on one particular area, you may see a decrease across all of your deductions. However, it can feel really overwhelming when you feel like you've got, some supply chain defects over here and missing invoices over here. It's like dominoes. If you knock one down, you're going to start to see the chain reaction. And then the last thing here, I know I talked about this a little bit, but with Amazon, you only have 30 days to dispute. So if you're not currently disputing your Amazon deductions, you may be losing a lot of opportunity to go back and win and get paid back for your deductions because you're missing that timeline. So I think Peter did send that one in the chat. If not, he will here in a second, but that's another great Amazon webinar that we've got that I would highly suggest checking out if you have issues with timing on your Amazon deductions. All right, now I'm excited to get into this section because we've kind of revamped it for today's. We're really practicing with some of our new co-op materials. So I'm excited to kind of talk through this. And we're going to go into that second bucket of deductions and provisions, but we do need a little bit of context first about co-ops. So if you've worked at other retailers, you may know this term more under trade allowances, trade promotions, or allowances. Co-op is Amazon's version of that. It's also known as commercial operations or contra, cost of goods sold. And it's a program that features a variety of agreements to help vendors promote their products to raise brand awareness by increasing traffic to their products. So very similar, if you're familiar with the term trade promotions or allowances, that's what an Amazon co-op is. Some of the examples of those are, your marketing activities. So your allowance type would be marketing and promotion. If you have a freight allowance, that's usually charges to the supplier for inbound freight. If you have product, like let's say you ship a lot of wine glasses, you probably have a damage allowance because it's inevitable when shipping things, even with the amount of bubble wrap and styrofoam, you're probably going to have damaged goods. So if you have something that's more breakable products, you probably have a damage allowance just because things are going to happen. And then if you have charges for specific return types, another category that we see a lot is apparel. You'll probably have a returns allowance, especially with Amazon. I'm guilty of sending lots of clothes back on Amazon to see if they fit. So those are some of the examples you may see if you have a co-op with Amazon. And then we kind of talked about some of the co-ops, but just wanted to list these here so you have that information available to you. The co-op damages and freight allowances, those are accrued against net receipts to Amazon fulfillment centers on a monthly basis and accumulated for the entire month. And that's billed based on the schedule listed in the agreement terms. So high level, I'm going to talk through some of these that you may have not seen. You're like, well, my allowance looks different. These are some of the options you have available to you when you're doing an Amazon co-op. And then the other is a straight payment. This could be a fixed amount negotiated between Amazon and the vendor supplier representatives. This could be kind of high level, could be on a couple of different things. This is another payment way that you could have instead of, monthly, like the co-op damage and freight allowance. And then other things are the promotional allowance or the SPA flex agreements. And promotional allowances are going to be based on orders placed and not canceled during that promotion period. And these are usually going to come in the form of vendor-funded sales discounts. They're on an accrual basis, and that's going to be based on net sales instead of net receipts. And again, you'll get this slide deck. So I know I'm kind of spitting out very granular details, but we'll make sure that you have this information. And then the last one, I believe, is price protection agreements. And this just protects against a reduction in value of the units currently on hand and in transit. So those all sound really great, right? But as you know, there can be issues that occur. One of the things is just making sure that your agreement has all the correct information. We'll talk about provisional co-ops here in a second, but essentially those are going to be accrued and billed against receipts into Amazon fulfillment centers on a monthly basis. And provisional co-op rates may differ based on period, product group, agreement time, etc. And with that, sometimes invoices and shipments do not match because Amazon bases their totals on what their records show is actually received over a calendar month. So any specific month totals could differ due to the differences in dates between the vendor shipments dates received. So making sure you have all that information correct, making sure you're following that correctly, because if you're not applying those to your invoices, you may see some kind of error with that or a deduction if you're not applying the co-op that you do have, or vice versa. And then some suppliers may receive co-op deductions, kind of like I said before, and co-op deductions fall under the umbrella of accounts receivable or AR deductions, as Amazon will invoice suppliers through a deduction in their reoccurring payments for invoices. And then lastly, you just want to avoid being charged provisional co-op rates. Suppliers need to set up their marketing development funds, or MDF, lots of acronyms, their damage allowance, and if you have a freight allowance as well, before shipping items to Amazon. And why that's important is so you make sure that those agreements are being applied and you're not being either charged back for those or having any other errors with those being set up. And you can negotiate those with Amazon. You can do that through the portal, but make sure that once you've had that negotiated and that co-op agreement is in effect, that you are understanding that Amazon will stop charging you any provisional co-op rates and retroactively apply your negotiated rates during the time that the provisional co-op rates were charged. So just making sure that all of the timelines make sense and that you're adhering to what the co-op agreement lists. We talk a lot about understanding your supplier agreement in other webinars, and the Amazon Returns 101 webinar goes over kind of some of those key points that you want to make sure are correct in your Amazon agreement. And like I said, that second bucket with Amazon is provisions, and that kind of can tie into your co-ops as well. So those may also be referred to as holdbacks. Those are holds placed on your account by Amazon to ensure that the supplier is paying the amounts owed. And we'll go through this very quickly. Essentially wanted to kind of tie these together with how co-op works and how provisions work, because if you're not using your specific co-ops, you may see a provision and that kind of feels out of place with deductions, but it really does follow a pretty similar process. So provisions for receivables, essentially, this is based on Amazon's short-term forecast and what Amazon is expected to pay based on the invoices and deliverables. Essentially, Amazon's future receivables are greater than the supplier's payables, and provisions are only used when the supplier does not have the potential receivables to cover the amounts for marketing services and returns. Other things, provisions for missing actuals. This is going to be more due to any issues with your co-op, like we talked about before. In a brick and mortar context, like most suppliers kind of work in that before, Amazon came around, this is like not paying for a markdown. So you want to make sure that you are adhering to your co-op and that you're applying the terms correctly to your invoices and to the time period or whatever the terms are, so that you're not receiving a deduction for this. And then the last one here, this one's the least common out of the three types, but this is when an invoice for a co-op becomes aged. So if you're charged a provisional co-op rate, contact your vendor or your account manager to set up your co-op agreements as soon as possible. This is kind of what we're talking about, making sure those are set up before. And making sure that you have awareness that they are set up. You will, depending on how large your team is, you may not have insight into that. So you want to make sure that you're communicating to your team that those are being set up. And if you believe you were incorrectly billed for a co-op, you can actually dispute a co-op agreement invoice, and you can find that in Vendor Central. All right. Perfect that I ended on, going into Vendor Central, because we're going to learn how to navigate that here really quickly. All right, so I usually put this at the top of the hour, but this is kind of where it fell. And today's, we're focusing on Vendor Central. So Seller Central does have some overlap, and we haven't currently explored Seller Central as much. So you may see some things that are similar, but if you are selling on Seller Central, this may not be as applicable for you. And that's because we're focusing on our first party sellers. So what does that mean? Essentially, Amazon purchases product and then resells that to their customers, and it's by invitation only. So it's usually for established brands. You may only have one SKU, but you're not necessarily a marketplace seller who's buying things off of like Alibaba and then turning around and selling it. So you're also not selling directly to the consumer. You're really just selling to Amazon, similar in a way that you would sell to Walmart or Target or any of the other larger retailers. All right, so again, very simple, but we want to include this. When you're logging into Vendor Central, make sure that you have your one-time password set up and that you're doing that correctly, or you may struggle to have access to Amazon Vendor Central. And if you're only in Amazon, you're thinking about getting into other retailers, this is pretty common across all retailers, is doing two-factor authentication. So this is kind of what Vendor Central looks like at a high level. We have this image here on the payments tab, because that's really where we focus the most, especially when it comes to learning about disputes, understanding disputes, and then actually taking action about your your disputes at Amazon. So if you open up that tab, you can see some of the ones I've talked about. You can see the financial dashboard, co-op, which we've talked a lot about today, invoices, remittance, product returns, dispute management, and the financial scorecard. And how do you use some of these applications? Essentially, the financial dashboard, that's going to be your high level. That's a great temperature check of what's going on in your business, a view of payables and receivables. If you're having issues with, aged receivables and provisions, this may be a good place to kind of check that high level. Invoices is really an action page. You can create new invoices, review rejected invoices, shortages, price discrepancies. It's what I would call that action page where you can actually, go in and make changes to things or dispute things, whereas some of these other ones are more dashboards to kind of understand the business and analyze. The third one here is the financial scorecard. That's going to be data for diagnosing and addressing issues in supply chain. That one's pretty helpful as well. And then lastly is more of an action tab or a review tab, and that's going to be your dispute management. It's just another dispute viewpoint for creating and reviewing types of disputes. Let's say you submit something in invoices. After you're done, it should show up here. All right. All of these are super easy to find. You just go to Vendor Central, go to payments, and then you click on that term that you're looking for. And we kind of already went through this. This is just dummy data, but essentially you can kind of see where you're sitting at your business. Very helpful for high level, for more of the either directory levels or et cetera. And then invoices, again, very simple. We kind of went through this. You can see create invoice, view rejected invoice, review disputes and shortages, review and dispute price discrepancies. And something that's helpful is these buttons kind of change depending on what you have in your queue. So, if you don't have a rejected invoice, then you may not see this button that says review rejected invoices. That's not always the case. I would check other applications just to make sure things are going through. And if you're seeing issues, submit that to Vendor Central. But essentially, when things are working 100% correct, you should be able to kind of see what you have at a high level and then take action by clicking into these buttons. Financial scorecard, we kind of talked about this a little bit at the top of the hour. Again, this is dummy data, but purchase price variance, incorrect quantity received, already invoiced. You can kind of see at a high level where your deductions are, defect amount, the total amount invoiced, and what, the actual details of what this means and how you can then go and decide how you want to do root cause analysis. And then last, this was, kind of another action or review page. Go to Vendor Central, payments, dispute management, and you can kind of see what you've submitted or what needs to be worked on with your Amazon disputes. And then other things that are helpful is if you want more education on this, we're happy to provide that at Supplier Wiki. But again, Amazon does have helpful documentation. It's kind of in the form of like videos / basically slide decks with some animation is what it feels like. But you can go in to learn. And then if you're specifically interested in some of the disputes and deduction stuff, I would look at payments. And then compliance and sustainability does have some of those standards that Amazon is looking for. So it's another helpful way to navigate that. And then kind of the tricky part about Amazon is you don't necessarily have a human that you're interacting with on a day-by-day basis, but you can actually go into support in the top right-hand corner, and you can contact Amazon support based on either you can change your business group, you can change the issue, and you can either request a call or send an email. So not everyone knows about that, but really easy to use, and usually they're pretty timely. All right, now let's kind of go into a workflow of how you actually dispute shortages deductions at Amazon. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we're running short on time, but essentially this is what I would say if you don't know where to start when it comes to disputing Amazon deductions. Here's a great little checklist for making sure from beginning to end that you understand what is expected of you and making sure your team understands this as well. This will help you reduce a lot of your errors that you may be seeing when it comes to supply chain defects. And top of the list, just ensuring accuracy. We talked about that on your catalog setup. Invoice content must match PO and ASN. Cancel invoices with enough time if you're unable to make the shipment. Send invoices 1 to 4 days before the delivery date. Don't send it, 2 months before, a week before, or, like right when they're expected to be delivered. So making sure it's in that 1 to 4 day window. Only one label on your carton or master pack, making sure that that's correct. No UPCs in carton or master pack. That will create lots of different issues. And then I've reviewed this several times, but read up on Amazon's suggestions for reducing vendor lead time and labeling and delivery compliance. Those are kind of those 2 key documents I would look at. And then just important caveats for Amazon's deduction process. You may have, come as a supplier from Walmart or Amazon, Target, and you're coming to Amazon. Here's some key things that we've seen with working with the suppliers we have on deductions. PODs or proofs of delivery are not required and aren't always going to be helpful documentation. You can always try and attach those to your Amazon deductions, your disputes. But again, I would say focus on some of the other documentation that Amazon prefers. Other things, EAN codes, delivery or collection dates are preferred because they're directly related to this dispute. So if you have access to those, I would share those in your proof documentation because that seems to be more helpful than your PODs or your BOLs. And then this is very key, but making sure that you're only fined for the short paid items, so the items that are not matched on the invoice. And versus what's being received, and not the entire invoice. If you're being fined for the entire invoice, that means that they received nothing. So if you're seeing a discrepancy between what was actually received and the full amount of the invoice, you can dispute that. But usually Amazon's really good about only fining you for those items that are short paid. All right, so let's go through this pretty quickly. What happens when you start a dispute? Amazon's going to notify you, and it should go to the person or department responsible for accounts receivables. You should receive some kind of email. I would make sure that if your team is changing roles, that person is changed over so you're not missing any opportunity to dispute. And then if you're not receiving any notifications, you can just go to settings and change that really quickly. And that'll be helpful for staying on top of things, knowing if you should, spend time disputing. Our recommendation is you, as a supplier, someone on your team should be checking at least weekly what types of deductions are coming into your Amazon accounts so you can act quickly on those disputes. The second step is determining if the claim is valid or invalid. So Amazon has 2 checks before the supplier is notified. Their system's going to search for a match for the invoice, and shortage claims are always going to be sent 5 days before the invoice is due. And because of these checks, Amazon has set up the 30-day. It can be 40 days sometimes, but really we've seen suppliers have optimal dispute resolutions when they're doing it in that 30-day window. So making sure your priority is acting quickly because of these checks. And then on step 3 here, you're actually going to go into invoices and you'll go ahead and click review and dispute shortages, and you can do that there. And it's important before you go into the system and you start digging in or adding your proof documentation that you decide if that claim is invalid and what that story is going to look like for your specific claim. So you would go into your invoices. You can see all of the information, like the invoice status, the amount paid, what the dispute status is. This wouldn't be resolved in that case, but you would go in and say, okay, I'm going to actually click into dispute this by ASN. You can also look at some of the details there. And you can either, it's more on the left-hand side, but you could either click one or select all to dispute all of them. What we've seen with suppliers, mostly, you can do that, But if it's your first time on specific types of deductions, we say submit it one by one so you have a clear understanding on what's going on in your dispute process. And then essentially you're just going to fill out a form. And this is why it's important to kind of know how you want to dispute this before you go in and start just putting information down. So you want to fill out in this dispute quantity what you believe was delivered, the shipped product. So making sure that the ASN, the EAN, or the other barcode of the product is whatever's being disputed is clear. And then the shipped date. So for prepaid, that's going to be when the products were delivered to Amazon. And for collect, that's going to be when the date of the goods were handed to the carrier. And then in the comments, you can include information to assist with your claim. And this might be the ASN, images of carton level labels. It can be a lot of different things that we've kind of talked about, and making sure you're attaching that proof documentation. Other things, this is more optional. It's more for the reference of the supplier. So dispute title, if you have hundreds of disputes, you may want to, put the EAN or something to reference it by, or if you have some internal code. This isn't necessarily going to be viewed by the Amazon team that is deciding the validity of this dispute. This is more for internal with your team. So this could be any additional information or context that may help your team understand the claim. And then optional items is for adding any supporting documents there, emails of colleagues to be included in further communication, etc. So I wouldn't necessarily put like the linchpin of your dispute in this section as well. And then once you've submitted it, you can either cancel the invoice, the dispute, if you see any information that's revealed that the claim is valid. You can wait until you receive repayment, but remember, doing things right the first time is key with Amazon, because you only have 30 days, and Amazon, unlike other retailers, does not allow for resubmissions. You can do a resubmission, but it's a more tedious process. It's email based, and you would really have to have a solid case to be able to reverse the dispute resolution at Amazon. All right, so we've got just a little bit of time left. I'm wondering if we have any questions in the chat. Peter, I haven't seen anything, so just let me know if we do have any questions. I'd love to answer.
Oh, well, we only have one question just about EAN codes. What are those?
Okay.
What do they mean?
Yeah. EAN is essentially, I want to make sure I'm saying this right, like a barcode, essentially.
Yeah.
It's, I believe it stands for European article number, which feels so funky to me, but it's just like a barcode. It's a 13-digit. And that's the way that usually Amazon works through that, correct?
Yes. Yeah, a quick Google search will give you a little answer to that question too. But yeah, that's for identifying products, I believe. So what specific product is this? That's, I think, how Amazon uses it. But
yeah, that's how I agree as well. Yeah. Sweet. Other questions?
No other questions, I don't think, or I don't think that we have any. Please get them in if you have any kind of remaining or lingering questions. But we've got our emails up here that you can also take note of as well for sending any kind of further questions or follow-ups, or if you want to request a particular kind of content that we cover in the future, you can use those for that as well.
Sweet. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. That's all we've got for today. And if you don't have a chance to grab our emails, they're on other slide decks or other resources online, but you can always find us at supplypipe.com and we'll get you connected to the right team. With that, Peter, I have nothing else to share, so I just wish everyone a great rest of their Thursday. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you at another webinar.
All right. See y'all.